to the Remington Podcast, where we take a deep dive into all things ammunition. I'm your host, Audrey Mays, and today I'm sitting down with Head of Research and Development, John Langenfeld.
Hello, everybody.
And Ballistics Engineer, James Lawrence.
Happy to be here.
Also known as Jimmy. I think that's the first time I've ever called you James. So I don't know why that came out of my mouth. But today we're going to dive into the journey from Wildcat to SAAMI standardization. We have two people who know the subject very well. And so first off, I want to throw the question up to you guys. What exactly is a Wildcat cartridge?
I would define that as something that's not commercially produced.
Okay.
Doesn't necessarily have to be full SAAMI, CIP, or NATO approved. But, in the general sense, it's you can't go buy it. Mm-hmm. Whether it's brass or loaded rounds, in order to create the cartridge, you've had a reamer made, you've had dies made, you're forming a case out of something else, and you're wildcatting.
Okay.
And so you can't just go buy that brass off the shelf, load it yourself. And there are, at times cartridges that are kind of in that preliminary stage of SAAMI acceptance that you can go buy brass for, or you could go buy some cartridges for by some boutique, smaller manufacturers or brass makers. So I don't really feel like that's, a Wildcat cartridge anymore, even though it's not fully SAAMI approved. Usually they're kind of on their journey to getting there, but there may be some out there that are still kind of in that purgatory, so to speak, that you can go buy brass, but it's not loaded rounds, or the big players aren't manufacturing it yet. So that would be what I would call a Wildcat.
Okay. So what if you buy brass and then just neck it down to a different bullet size?
Well, it depends. So if I take let's say I take a 280 Remington and turn that into a 270 Winchester, I don't consider that wildcatting.
That's not wildcatting?
Exactly,
okay.
Because you can buy 270s. You're forming brass at that point. You're using dies and things. So wildcatting is really when you're creating something that you can't go buy.
Mm-hmm. A good example there was when the Ackley improved chambers became very popular, where all you had to do was buy a reamer to push your shoulder forward and square it up, and buy the 280 Remington factory ammunition. Either pull the bullet and fire form it that way, or actually fire the cartridge and fire form. Different people do it different ways, but the act of moving the dimensions around on that cartridge to match a new chamber is wildcatting.
Yeah, sure. Fire forming, necking down,
trimming.
It takes. There's different forms of the degree that you're changing a case. Mm-hmm. Some of it's pretty simple, where you just take a factory cartridge, shoot it, blows the shoulder out, and now you've got the new form, and you've removed body taper, you've changed the shoulder angle, and now it holds more powder. And then you reload that as the new Wildcat cartridge and have a different performance level. That's usually why people do it, is they want a different performance than what they can get, different caliber, different velocity. And it's wildcatting is still fairly popular today. If you get on any of the reamer websites, you can go through a whole list of cartridges that are not commercial cartridges that you can buy reamers for. And you're going to have to buy dies and have them made, things like that, but you can still do it.
What is a reamer?
So the reamer is it's a cutting tool.
Okay.
That is made in the shape of your cartridge, and that you use it to cut your chamber in the barrel. Mm-hmm. And you can also use probably not the same ones as you're doing your barrel, but you probably could, to do your dies.
Mm-hmm. And what is a die?
So your dies, they're your reloading tools.
Okay.
That you put in a press, and you use them to resize cases, move your metal around if you're pushing shoulders down, if you're necking down, and seating your bullets. Mm-hmm. And so usually the chamber reamers, precision bench rest type shooters, even though they have a non-Wildcat cartridge, will a lot of times take the reamers that they use for their chambers in their barrels and also use those on their sizing dies, so that they have 100% agreement that the cases that they're sizing match the chamber in their rifle. Mm-hmm. So it's about fitment and consistency.
Tolerances.
Okay.
Yeah, 100%. So that's your if you're trying to create something that you can't go buy, you've got to get a barrel. So you probably have to order a reamer.
Right.
And if you're the wildcatter, in my mind, that's the guy who generated it first. Not just wildcatting. I'm not just taking
the catter.
Yeah. So you're the guy that's created the drawing, ordered a reamer to your specifications, and then sent that to the barrel. Well, had the reamers made, and then send those to the barrel maker, send those to the die makers, and have your equipment and your barrel made up, and then have a rifle built and then start to figure out load development and watch your pressures and things like that. And it can be a very deep, involved process, or it could be as simple as just fire forming like a 280 and a 280 Ackley and moving the shoulder and reloading those.
But it's a very interesting market because you get to see, for lack of better terms, almost a free market on what people need, where there's performance gaps. Maybe they have a short action rifle and they want more performance out of it. So at the very, very early stages of all the new centerfire cartridges through the last century, there was writers and engineers across the nation trying different things. And just like John's talking about, you get a reamer, you can actually poke it to different depths and set your case length and your shoulder dimension differently. And with it being a non-standard cartridge, the next guy can come and make adjustments, especially if he's cutting his own dies. So if you want to move a shoulder back and straighten it out some, you can use the reloading die to actually move the brass. Whereas when you're just reloading a fired case, that die is only responsible for resizing the neck down to the correct diameter. So everything, in my mind, everything from the very first idea of taking a parent cartridge and changing it up to what John's mentioning, commercially available aftermarket barrels, dies, and brass, up to the point where someone sits down and agrees that these dimensions are set, then it's Wildcat in its category.
That's really interesting that you brought up that there's different degrees of wildcatting.
Oh yeah.
Is it like an interesting culture? Like, well, I'm more of a wildcatter than you are.
I wouldn't doubt it. I mean,
We can see that in the handloaders.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I followed the manual, or no, I went out off the reservation or off the rails and did whatever I wanted.
Yeah. So absolutely. I mean, comfort level, as far as mechanical ability, knowing, having education about cartridges and what they do, and like Jimmy said, pulling open a reloading manual and saying this is the exact powder charge and primer and case and length that I'm going to do, versus I'm going to measure the jump to my lands and I'm going to seat a bullet to the depth that I want. If it's outside SAAMI, it's outside SAAMI. You're in control of that. As long as it feeds through your magazine box,
right.
And there's things around that. So I've been doing this since I was probably like 13 years old.
Really?
Oh yeah. I think I got my first. Well, I've got one Wildcat. I started hand loading shot shells when I was 12, and bolted a single stage press to a computer desk in the basement, and. Shortly thereafter, I started dabbling with centerfire metallic loading, and then started with 22-250. But probably when I was around, maybe like 18 or 19, I acquired a Wildcat rifle, dies, and components from a friend, a mentor of mine. And he wasn't in on. He kind of worked loosely with. The guys that Wildcatted it. I think he was kind of in that test group and whatnot, and had some collaboration. So anyways, it's called a 33 GNA, like guns and ammo, GNA. And there was a few GNA cartridges done in 30, the 338, which we call the 33. I know that there was at least a 460 GNA done. Maybe some other stuff, 416, 375s. I mean, who knows? They're still Wildcats. But so this particular cartridge predates the Ultra Magnums, the Remington Ultra Magnums.
Okay.
Very, very closely. I mean, you could almost say that the Ultra Magnums came from the GNAs, because this is a 404 Jeffrey-based cartridge that has a non-rebated rim. The Ultra Magnums have a rebated rim so that they'll fit in standard actions. Well, the rifle that I own doesn't have a standard bolt face. It's made to fit the 404 head. Anyways, there's two ways to form this case. You can go buy 404 Jeffrey cases, run them through the forming dies to get it neck down to hold a 338 caliber bullet. So the cases start out with a big shoulder and taper,
Right.
And it's for 404 Jeffrey, so it's not going to hold a 338 bullet; it's just going to fall through it.
Mm-hmm.
So as you run it into these dies, it'll end up with a double shoulder. It's at the 404 Jeffrey shoulder, and then it's got this other shoulder up here, so it holds the 338.
So it looks a little funky.
Oh yeah, mm-hmm. And then what you would do is you would fire form that in your chamber.
Okay.
And so when you put pressure behind it, it's going to blow the case out to match your chamber walls. Mm-hmm. Then you can now load it as a 33 G&A.
So you have to shoot it first. Is that what you're saying?
Sometimes you do.
Okay.
That depends on if you start with 404 Jeffries or not.
Uh-huh.
So yes, you would have to shoot it first to fire form it to your chamber walls. And there are some cartridges that you have to do that. I have a full set of forming dies. Here at the factory, we'd call them taper dies.
Okay.
And when I acquired the rifle, I got about 500, give or take, unformed virgin tubes. Mm-hmm. So you would, here at the factory, we would probably call that a
HDD.
It'd be a headed piece. So it's got the extractor groove. It's headed. There's no head stamp, primer pocket, flash hole. It's just a straight tube, though. It's ready, body annealed. It's ready to go to ready to go to taper. And so I can run that through. I think there's maybe 6 forming dies. So I batch it in stages where I run them all, lube them up and run, whatever I'm going to do. Say I'm going to do 100. I'll run all 100 of them through the first die.
Okay.
And what it starts doing is it starts necking it down.
Tapering it. And
squeeze it down a little bit. And then it starts the shoulder position. And, of course, every time you do that, they're going to get longer. Mm-hmm. So once you've run 100 through, then you go to your second die, your third die, and it keeps working that down till there's a trim die.
Okay. I was going to ask.
So there's a trim die in there. It's been a while since I've formed them up, but there's a trim die in there. And what I usually do is take some kind of a power cutoff or something. If you had a disc or, I guess you could use a hacksaw blade, whatever. You got brass sticking out of the top of this die.
Yeah.
You got to cut that off. Mm-hmm. And so take your pick, cut it off, don't damage your die. And then I would usually take a fairly fine file, not too aggressive, and I would just hit the top of that just to smooth out any burrs or whatever that's on it so it's kind of flat. And then the next one is a reamer die. Okay. Because as you neck down, your brass is getting thicker.
Okay.
Okay, so now I'm cut off, but the neck wall thickness is way thicker than it needs to be because I've squeezed it down.
So it's thicker at the top than it is at the bottom?
Yeah, I've worked it.
Well, at the shoulder.
Okay, yeah. I see what you're saying.
Offset the material.
Yep.
So at that point, I've got a T-handle and I've got a reamer, and I dip it in some cutting fluid, and every single case I go in and hand ream. So it's held in the die. So you put the reamer in it, and I hand ream the case.
Basically, just shave the inside out.
It's exactly what you're doing. Is you're cutting the neck thickness thinner. Mm-hmm. Yep. So you go in and ream out the center of it to set your neck wall thickness. And then I think after that, I would probably run them through. Then you finally get to the standard full length sizing die that you use, as you shoot and size. So your standard full length sizing die, that will set your final neck tension. And then when I run that process versus using a 404 Jeffrey, the fire forming to the chamber is very minimal.
Okay.
To the point where I don't need to do it. So you can still see slight rounded corners versus a defined sharp corner on the shoulder once it's fired. But the performance difference and accuracy difference is negligible. So I'm not wasting components and barrel life just blowing these shoulders out to make them, just a little bit more defined. So I don't even worry about it.
Okay.
So yeah, it's an interesting cartridge. Performance-wise, when it was wildcatted, there really wasn't a consumer 338 Magnum that was of that power level. And this one is slightly different than a 338 Ultra because it's longer. So if you compare the difference between a 300 rum and a 338 rum, there's not a lot of room to stick the bullet outside the case mouth on a 300 rum because of the case length. Mm-hmm. So the 338 rum has actually got a shorter shoulder, and it's a little more forgiving, seating bullets into your magazine box and all that. So this one, since there's, you built it up on a 404 Jeffrey and the action of your choice to maximize length, the case length is essentially like the 300 Rum, but it's a 338, 35 degree shoulder, and it'll duplicate, 338 Lapua performance in a 24-inch barrel.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I run 250 grain bullets at 3,000 feet per second. And, what kind of makes the rifle unique, and it can be good and bad, pros and cons here. When I was 18 years old, I thought, this is great. The rifle is built by, and the guy's passed away now, Mel Forbes at Ultralight Arms. So the rifle only weighs, scoped with like, say, 12-ounce, loophole, 7.25 pounds ready to go.
So it's good backpacking.
Oh, it's lightweight. Yeah. And it's, it's got a lot of power, but it also, there's a fairly significant amount of recoil with
Fun
this
to
gun.
blink with.
Oh, yeah. I mean, when you're, churning out 100 grains of H1000 and running 3,000 plus with 230, 250 grain bullets, I wouldn't just let anybody torch that thing off. But anyways, I've since put a muzzle brake on it, and I didn't have one. I didn't have one for many, many years, and I was kind of a mindset that if something needed to break, then I probably really didn't need it that bad.
Sure.
And so, and also noise, because I'm a hunter. And, but anyway, so yeah, it's a light rifle, and it's unique. So one Wildcat for me is enough. I like to be able to go buy brass.
I was going to say, how many of these do you own was my next question.
Just one. One's enough. And once I form the cases, though, once I go through that first effort, and it's got a sharp shoulder on it, so they don't stretch much. And if you take care of your brass, if you don't overpressure them, if you anneal in between shootings, it'll last a long time. And again, this isn't a target rifle, so I formed up 100 cases that I've been shooting on since I got the brake on the gun, and it's a little easier on me to shoot it. I've probably shot it almost as much or more than I've owned since I've owned it, just because it's not kicking the holy crap out of me.
Right.
But again, it wasn't one that I was just fond of going and doing load development with. Once I had a load, I just hunt it. And so now I'm kind of like, well, I can shoot more than 6 rounds on the bench and not go home with a headache and feel like I got whiplash. And so anyways, yeah.
So are you going to play with it now? Like, are you going to
I'm probably going to use it on an elk hunt this fall.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's awesome.
So I was going to use it last year, and that's the rifle I talked about in the podcast.
That you took a Wildcat with you?
So that's the gun. The scope that I had on the rifle gave up the ghost right before I left. And I didn't have time to go back in and redo all that stuff. So I just pulled 2 other rifles out of the safe and said, we're taking these. But, assuming that I draw an elk tag, which I'm going to put in for here before the end of the month, if I get the elk tag, and I get another scope, right now I didn't have anything on it. It's just been sitting there. So I've just been busy. But yeah, it's going to go on the hunt.
That's exciting.
So I'm going to take it and actually use it. I've killed whitetail with it, and coyote, because that's what I had in my hands. But I've personally yet to hunt it for something I feel like justifies the power level of the cartridge. So I
was going to say, smacking a coyote with that's
yeah. Oh,
that's
yeah.
a bit much.
I feel like there's been quite a few hunts booked over the years to get the max out of the systems that we put together like that.
That's true.
Yeah.
I've got a 308 and I've shot whitetail with it. I'd say that's probably good enough. But if I had something that big, it'd be going for something.
It's a
big boy.
Yeah, it was thought up as the ultimate elk rifle, and the original owner did hunt it in Colorado. And so what was kind of going to make it special last year is because that's my mentor friend. He built the rifle to be the ultimate elk gun. He killed an elk with it in Colorado on the ranch right across the street from where we were hunting, and he was on the hunt.
Oh, with you.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And so I was going to use his rifle originally, basically where it once was and all that stuff. It didn't work out. I tried hard, but
was he one of the Johns?
He's one of the Johns.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, he's actually not going to go on this hunt this fall. He's waiting to go next year. But regardless, I've already got text messages from him that's like, "What are you going to take? You going to take the 33? You got it scoped yet?" So yeah. So he'll be getting pictures of groups and things like that. I'll get it up and running. But one Wildcat for me is enough. I do enjoy a piece of doing all that, and There's guys that, they ream them, they neck turn them, and they can get more involved than what I do. But like I said, one's enough.
That's a pretty whole package of processing that you just listed out, because that's about everything you could do at the house to hand build ammunition. So everyone has, kind of like we're talking about, how much of a wildcat are you? The hand loaders have an idea of how custom are you making your ammo. When you actually start the taper progression, and then you got to anneal and all those things that we're doing here in the factory, but at home one at a time. Basically, the only things you can't do yourself are, and you could.
You can, yeah.
Things like head turn, modifying the rim like he's talking about, or lengthening the brass, where you would actually have to go back and draw out more of that draw piece before you started tapering. That's where you really draw the line of what you can modify yourself, and then what then kind of has to become a factory cartridge.
And by that, I think you mean like safely do yourself.
Even conveniently.
Okay.
I mean,
it's
pretty hard to draw out brass longer without thinning it out almost too much to use.
You really don't see that. Usually you got to start with a basic. You need more material than what you're going to end up with usually.
Okay.
And then we form from there and neck it down or trim it and ream it out. There's a whole list of things that you can do. That's one I've only done. I don't mess with other ones. My friend John, he got back into wildcatting here recently and has been playing with kind of a legacy cartridge. They call them the Mashburn Super Magnum. There was a family of Mashburn cartridges back in the day, and they predate the 7mm Remington Magnum. And I know we're going to kind of lead into, what are some cartridges that were in that kind of freelance category that made
came over here.
Yeah, that made it to a major manufacturer. And anyways, these super Magnum type cartridges, Warren Page was in. He was a writer, and he was wildcatting and using these things. And there were three lengths. There was the short one, which ended up being the 7mm Remington Magnum. And I don't know if it was the exact dimensions of shoulder angle and everything per the Wildcat ones, but essentially it was the 300 H&H case belted Magnum that was turned into a 7mm and made a certain length. The intermediate length one is still today not a factory cartridge, and that's what they call the Mashburn Super Magnum, the MSM. You can form that usually out of taking 300 Win Mag brass, necking it down to 7mm, and then you might have to ream it out because they get what they call a donut down there right around the base of the shoulder. And then the longer one, we actually turned into the 7mm STW. So it was commercial. So the short one was a 7 Rim Mag, the long one was STW. Okay. But the middle one
is still out there.
It's still out there. So pretty popular cartridge. It's supposed to be kind of the best blend of efficiency. It's not so overboard like the STW that you need the big mag boxes and what you're actually getting for the grain, how much powder you're putting in the cartridge. But yeah, my buddy John, he's got three Super Magnums that he's playing with, and different rifle types and weights and things like that. And, I think that was just something to do again for him. Yeah. Get back into Wildcat and tinker with it and play with it. And I think he's got one or two different reamer designs. Throat links, I think, is the difference on them. And maybe one's a little bit more accurate than the other or something like that. But I don't know if he'll keep doing it. He's kind of talked about rebarreling them and just going back to, a 7 Rim Mag or something.
Well, I assume that I know that wildcatting is a way to get more intimate with your shooting experience, the same way that bow hunters maybe craft their own arrows. But it's probably more convenient to just go to the store and buy some. No?
Oh, yes.
Well, that's where kind of the next stage of the life cycle comes in. Because there's, again, depending on where you draw the line between Wildcat and Standard, even someone like Elmer Keith or any of the writers from a long time ago had this idea. They go to a factory and say, hey, I want to try this, but I can't make, say, back in the 30s, my 38 Special needs to be longer to make the 357 Magnum. You have to go get an ammo company on your side and then go find a gun company and kind of pull it all together. And before it's standardized, they might be already trying to market it, but then you have to go standardize that for everyone to agree on several different gun companies cutting the same chamber and several different ammo companies not just loading at the same pressure but the same dimensions on the rim and all that stuff so it works. So watching this market and seeing which of these things are picking up pace And then someone going and jumping on that and pulling it in as a standardized cartridge has been a game that we've, in this industry, all had to play for the last, let's call it 100 years. To be the first in the market in that little use case. And sometimes it is something as boutique-y as I need just a little bit more energy. I love this pattern of rifle, this strength of the action, the size of the bolt shroud, things like that. Other times it's an entirely empty market that no one has filled yet, and someone comes up with a Wildcat. There's 3 different versions to choose from. Not a lot of silhouette shooting left around. It still exists, but there was a period in time when it was extremely popular. So you have a 7mm bench rest XP100. That was technically standardized by Remington as a cartridge, but originally started as a group of Wildcats based off of the 308 by 1.5 inch Barnes, something like that. Yeah. And they made a few different calibers. And we had made a little bit of factory ammo, but mostly made the brass. So at that point in time, you would almost say that was no longer a Wildcat. But John can't go buy that ammo from the factory anymore.
And is this the difference between wildcatting, standardized, and proprietary ammo?
We're into the gray area now.
Okay.
Yeah, because there's cartridges out there from, we talked a little bit. Like I said, I don't remember if the Dakota cartridges, if any of them ever got to SAAMI or not. I'd have to go look. Another one that comes to mind is the Lazzaronis. At one time, Weatherby pre-SAAMI, I think most of them are all in there now. But
there's a few of them never made it.
Yeah, so you can go buy Lazzaroni ammunition from Lazzaroni.
Okay.
At one time, you could go buy Dakota ammunition from Dakota, but they weren't SAAMI accepted, standardized exactly. So I don't consider that wildcatting. At the beginning of the stage, before they actually put it in a box and gave it a name and said, you can buy this, absolutely. They were trying to figure out and changing this, changing that, and you're in the process of wildcatting something new and figuring it out. But I think once you cross the line and say, I can either go buy these components, they're readily available, even if it's not standardized, I think that, you might run into proprietary as maybe a more appropriate term.
That's where the line is for you.
Well, and yeah, you have to think. SAAMI was started in 1926, 99 years. So they turn 100 next year. Before that, there was plenty of ammo on the shelf available. So you had a Remington gun and a Remington chambering. And it was almost like the proprietary look you're going after here, where the standardization is kind of like fit out assembly. I know that this bolt from this company fits with its matching nut, but if you want to go over to the other bolt maker, then there's got to be some standardization for the threads are going to fit up. So that's where
interchangeable parts,
the interchangeability, which is a huge part of industry, they had to sit down and figure out how to do that, because we were all of a sudden getting European imports come to America and then try to load our ammunition in those rifles, and it just wouldn't fit. And so everything from those shoulder locations, rim diameters. And then all of a sudden, when a member company takes that load to SAAMI to standardize, they have to supply the whole package of technical details, not on how to make the ammo, but on what it needs for interchangeability across several different rifle manufacturers and ammo companies. And then all of a sudden, it is standard for anyone to make to the recipe, if you will.
So take 360 buck hammer.
Right.
We introduced that package. Any of the gun companies can go, as SAAMI members, get access to those drawings. And then there's, of course, the non, the public domain information as well. If they're not SAAMI, they can still go see what the chamber drawing looks like. So you can get Marlins and Rossies and,
Henry's and
Henry and Traditions and Thompson Centers, they, and that when we make 360 buck hammer ammo, or when ideally someday somebody else does too, they all work in everybody's guns. So that's your standardization.
And that's the point.
Yep.
Yeah, a great example of that little life cycle, just going from you can do it at the house to you can buy it on the shelf. One of the more recent, and I say recent, it's probably been 20 years now, there was a definite Wildcat known that was 300 Whisper, and it was very popular because you could shoot a subsonic 30 caliber bullet from an AR length gun. So what you would do is you would take 223 brass, trim it off at the shoulder, and neck it down to 308 caliber neck, and assuming that your sizing dies were all correct and you put the shoulder at the right spot like you were mentioning, then you would hand load this recipe, and you would buy a 300 blackout barrel whether it's a single shot or 300 Whisper.
Gave the cat out of the bag now.
300 Whisper from, I think, some of the single shot rifle companies had pushed the reamers and dies and things like that. Remington and AAC teamed up to SAAMI standardize that, and it became the 300 AAC Blackout. Now, in the process of engineering that cartridge to the point of being standard, they make slight changes to some geometry and locations and the barrel drawings and things like that. All of a sudden, someone has to write it down for the first time, and it may be different from the original design concept, but now it's standard, and anyone can go to that reamer drawing and say, this is what a blackout chamber should look like.
Do they do that? Do they make those small changes to make that cartridge more repeatable? Or like, why are these small changes made as they move from Wildcat to
manufacturability? And there's what I would call robustness of design. So if you're going to fire form your own brass every single time, the geometry is almost taking care of itself. But if I need to go down that taper line like John was talking about and then come over here and match up with everyone's chambers and everything needs to fit and fire and function correctly, you might have to change a little thing here and a little thing there for it to work out full scale. So one of the processes that the SAAMI meetings encompass is the approval period. And SAAMI doesn't de facto approve anything, but what they do is they submit this package to the industry, and everyone has a chance to look at it and say, can I make this? If not, why? And then you can actually recommend changes to that standardized recipe if something looks like it's not for the entire industry to get on and make. If you got proprietary technology required to hit certain dimensions or strengths, people can raise their hand and say, hey, I don't think this is fair as a standard. So that intermediate period there is part of the process of writing down the recipe for all the generations to come to follow.
And we use SAAMI.
We're SAAMI members.
We are SAAMI here at Remington, but there are different standardization methods, right? SAAMI, CIP, and NATO.
Yep, go ahead, Jimmy.
Yeah, in Europe they have the CIP, which is, I believe, French for the System Permanent International, something like that, right? It's not dissimilar to any other organization's body, even SAAMI, except for it's run by the governments in each of those nations. Okay. So in America, we were given the option by the government, you either self-govern or we will govern you, figure it out. So they came together and formed the Sporting Arms and Ammunition Manufacturers Institute, where we are allowed to, at an industry level, self-govern. So it'd be like if you wanted to get rid of a government agency and leave it down to the corporations, we've been living that life for the last 99 years. Oh. And as long as we're responsible and we make the right decisions and keep everything clean and organized, we will continue to be allowed to operate that way. Whereas if you go to Europe to standardize a cartridge and load and sell in those nations, it has to be recognized by the CIP. And then they have government oversight in each of the CIP nations as to what is or isn't standard and actually approved. Everything from rifle manufacture and proofing all the way down to loading the ammunition. So, and then
similar but
NATO,
different.
Yeah. So SAAMI's very American.
Yep.
Is what I'm getting at here. Yeah. Well, that's a really cool process. I clearly have learned a lot on this podcast, so maybe I'll get into hand loading.
Why would you? Why would you?
Honestly, I'm not sure. Why would you get into hand loading? Actually, that's a great question.
Customization?
It depends on your goal.
Cost.
So cost could be a factor if you're a high volume shooter and you're trying to buy things in bulk so that you can load them cheaper than you can buy them from a manufacturer. So some things you can do that just in pure cost, but other things is you're not paying for somebody else's time. Right. It's your time. So figure out what your time means to you before you start hand loading. Customization of the ammunition is probably one of the biggest factors because you can tailor the ammunition to the firearm.
Bullet selection, all those things.
Yeah, you can do anything. You can go buy anybody's shells, anybody's bullets, anybody's powder, and I mean, there's a wealth of information and loading data out there. You can change your lengths. You can change, your velocity. Again, at the end of the day, it's about tailoring the ammunition to the rifle as a system to get the peak performance. And And also the application. Are you shooting targets? Are you shooting PRS? Are you just hand loading hunting ammo? What are you doing? And so, and it's a hobby. There's satisfaction in that.
Why cook at the house, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's like, I'm going to eat out all the time versus I'm going to, maybe you like it better. Maybe you think you can make it better. Some people make it worse.
And I should mention for the listeners, the only reason I asked Audie why should you hand load, it's tongue in cheek, of course. We work at an ammo plant, and it takes a lot of need for custom ammo that we don't load here for us to go make it ourselves. But there are a lot of us around the plant that do.
Yep, I've never
John
stopped.
himself included.
Yeah, no, I never stopped. I shoot Remington ammo on media hunts. I shoot a ton of the shot shell ammo, but I enjoy it.
Yeah.
I've got a whole lab at the house and the equipment, and I like experimenting. And I think that I shoot more because I hand load, because I'm always in this continuous cycle of testing what I'm loading. It's very rare that I go shoot a rifle just to shoot it.
Just to pull the trigger.
Right. I don't go out just to make noise. There's usually a reason, and I'm chronographing and collecting accuracy. And probably the only time I get to the point where I'm shooting a single load consistently is whenever I'm checking trajectory and validating, that with the amount of clicks on a turret or something, preparing for a hunt. But other than that, it's usually evaluating a powder or a bullet or something and a lot of times I can bring that back into the role here hey, try this, do that, or this is what I learned. So I would like to think it makes me better at my job, more in tune with ammunition manufacturing, because I still do it, and I do it because I enjoy it. I have to do it for my Wildcat if I want to shoot the thing. But that's, like I said, that for me, that's why. Shot shell ammunition, when I started loading it, was more so around availability of trap loads. I don't.
Well, all of a sudden you get your consistency. If you have your recipe, you don't have to go find that flat of that load from that company a year after year.
Yeah, and I don't even know if I wanted to buy shotgun shells in bulk at that time period. I guess I could have went to Walmart or something, but right out of the gate, it was like, you should load your own shells. And I was like, well, what do I need to do that? And they're like, well, buy one of these. And I was like, Mom, I need a loader. So, and my mom's been very supportive and probably like, what did I let this kid do? But yeah,
now
so
look at you.
right. Look where I ended up, Mom. But
My
anyways,
hobby's my job now.
So start loading ammo but that was volume. And I always found it a lot easier. The gun club is handy for me now because I can just run down there and buy a case of shells or 10 cases of shells or whatever I need. Where before it was always easy for me to, I had bulk components. I always had 8 pounds of powder and a case of wads and cases of primers. And so if I needed 5 cases of shells, I could load them up. Or if I needed, just a couple boxes, I could load those. So kind of having control of my own destiny with the quantity or whatever. But again, I still do it today because, I don't know, it's kind of a decompressing. Loading shotgun shells for me it's not really.
It's cathartic.
So that's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
I feel like hand loading or reloading shotgun shells is easier.
Shotgun shells. The rifle stuff is, I'm a little bit, that's a little bit more, I don't know.
You have to, your brain neneeds to be on.
Engaged.
Okay, to load a rifle.
Engaged of
cartridge.
what am I doing and making a conscious decision of I'm going to change this, the level of notes that I'm keeping, because I've got a file on every rifle.
Inspecting every cartridge every time.
You're pulling out, your file. Where was I at a year ago? What was I doing? Why was I shooting this powder? Looking at extreme spread, looking at dispersion.
Yeah.
All that kind of stuff. And I can go home after work and pour components in a shot shell loader, and all the volumetric stuff is set up from the last time.
Yeah.
Of course, I've got it in my notebook what my recipe is, but I can just stand there before dinner and load a couple hundred rounds, and it's kind of
no drinking, folks.
I usually my wife helps me pack. Sometimes we'll sit on the couch watching TV after dinner, and I'm like, well, I got to pack some shells.
Line them up.
No, and handgun's probably more similar to the shot shell side, because back when I used to shoot a lot of competitive pistol, there was a lot of people I would shoot with that rolled your own, so to speak. And it was one of those things where if they weren't hand loading their own recipe, not for performance or anything, but just purely for the cost. They weren't going to be able to be there every week. And here I am with ammo from our employee sales that might have been seconds or something like that, but it wasn't even something I was thinking about. And then I see these people over here, they're sharing notes on their Dillon press setup and what powder they're using and how to seat the primers so they go off every time. And it's its own little community here at the range, and they're there purely for the cost to get that thing as close to $0 per ring of the gong as they can. And wildcatting at some point is that for the guy who needs a cartridge to do something that isn't available.
Right.
So,
yeah. I would like to point out, read your manuals. Read your reloading manuals.
Which ones?
Read your hand loading manuals. Don't just don't experiment right out the gate if you don't know what you're doing. Safety. It is an explosion going off right in front of your face.
A very important part there, and that's for all hand loading, hand assembling, and factory assembling of ammunition. The gun is designed for a certain level of pressure, and every different type of firearm can handle a different amount of pressure. A Remington 700 can handle a lot. A pistol chambered lever action, maybe not as much. So a lot of times I see what would technically be considered a Wildcat is a hand loading recipe where someone will, as an example, put out data for 4570 plus P or 4570 plus P plus. And those are now theoretically separate chamberings from 4570 because the nomenclature plus P means I'm going to load to a higher than standard pressure.
Right.
Now, I know of rifles that can handle that pressure up to very high levels, but you go to an 1873 Springfield with someone's hand-loaded 4570 plus P, even if they knew what they were doing, and you're going to break things. So it all of a sudden you have a personal responsibility between you and that gun of how to be safe.
Yeah, I don't shoot other people's hand loads. Maybe one person.
Well, yeah.
Don't buy
you'd
them
have
at
to
the gun
trust
show.
them.
Don't buy hand loads. That's just a safety thing. They could be fine, but that's just part of the game.
Yeah. Well, there you have it, guys. Remington is on the rise. Like, comment, subscribe, and be sure to share this podcast with your hunting or shooting buddies. If you have any questions for me or John or Jimmy here, you can email us at podcast@remington.com. Thanks for listening.